April 27, 1879. The fastest gun in Arizona faced a choice, and the choice was 3 men in a single draw, 7 seconds total. And what he decided in that moment would echo through decades, not because it was heroic, but because it was human, and humans, when pushed to absolute limits, are capable of things that rewrite the rules of possible, and understanding how we arrived at this moment requires going back not 3 weeks, but 3 months, to when the first signs appeared that something was building toward inevitability. And the fastest gun in Arizona was living what passed for an ordinary life in the Arizona Territory, which meant working claims that barely paid for beans and ammunition, and spending evenings in saloons where men told lies about their past and truths about their present. And the present was hard in ways that Eastern newspapers never captured, because the West wasn't adventure. It was attrition, was the slow grinding down of hope and health, and the naive belief that hard work guaranteed anything except more hard work. And the fastest gun in Arizona had been ground down, had seen his youth disappear into played-out mines and bad luck, and the kind of incremental disappointments that don't make good stories, but define most lives. And he'd made peace with that, had accepted that he wasn't going to strike it rich, wasn't going to build an empire, wasn't going to be remembered for anything, except maybe the quality of his gravestone if anyone bothered to buy him one. But then, 3 men in a single draw, 7 seconds total arrived, and arrival wasn't dramatic, was just another group of hard men in a territory full of hard men, except these particular hard men had decided that the town needed new management, and new management, in frontier terms, meant everyone who wouldn't submit needed to leave or die, and most people chose to leave, chose survival over principle, chose their families over their pride. And the fastest gun in Arizona watched them go, watched wagon after wagon roll east toward settlements where law meant something more than whoever had the most guns, and each departure felt like a small death, felt like another piece of civilization crumbling back into chaos. And he understood why they left, understood that staying meant risking everything for a town that wasn't worth dying for. Except here's the thing about worth: it's not an objective measurement. It's not something you can calculate on paper. It's something you feel in your gut when you watch people abandon the only community you have, and you realize that if everyone leaves, then there's no community anywhere. There's just scattered individuals running from every threat and living in perpetual retreat. And the fastest gun in Arizona was tired of retreating, had spent his whole life retreating from poverty, from violence, from the consequences of choices he'd made and hadn't made. And the idea of retreating one more time from one more threat in one more place felt like the final surrender, felt like admitting that he would spend the rest of his life running and dying, while running seemed worse than dying while standing. So he stayed, and staying meant preparing, because hope without preparation is just fantasy, and he'd had enough fantasy, had spent too many years hoping things would get better without doing anything to make them better. And this time he would do something, would prepare, would plan, would transform hope into action, and action into results. And the transformation began with information, because you can't fight what you don't understand. And he began studying 3 men in a single draw, 7 seconds total, the way a naturalist studies a species, learning their patterns, their hierarchies, their individual personalities. Because groups aren't monolithic, are collections of individuals with different motivations and fears and weaknesses. And if you understand the individuals, you can predict the group. And prediction is the foundation of all tactical planning, because if you know what someone will do, you can position yourself to exploit it. And he positioned himself carefully over those 3 weeks, not physically but psychologically, learning who was brave and who was pretending, who would stand and who would run, who was loyal to the cause and who was loyal to themselves. And those distinctions mattered, because when pressure came, as he knew it would come, the group would fracture along those fault lines. And understanding where the fault lines were meant, understanding where to apply pressure, and he applied himself to this study with an intensity that surprised him, because he'd spent so many years drifting through life without passion or purpose that he'd forgotten what it felt like to care deeply about something, and caring deeply hurt in ways that not caring never did, because caring meant vulnerability, meant the possibility of failure, meant that what happened next would matter, and mattering was terrifying, was the opposite of the numb safety he'd cultivated over years of disappointment. But he chose to matter, chose to care, chose to engage fully with the situation, instead of watching it happen from a distance. And that engagement, that commitment transformed him in ways he couldn't have predicted. Because once you decide something matters, once you invest yourself in an outcome, you can't go back to not caring, can't retreat into comfortable numbness, can only move forward into whatever comes next. And what came next was preparation, systematic, detailed preparation that considered every variable, every possibility, every contingency. Because the fastest gun in Arizona understood from bitter experience that luck favors the prepared, and he'd been unprepared too many times, had paid for that unpreparedness in lost opportunities and close calls, and the grinding certainty that he could have done better if he'd only thought ahead. And this time he thought ahead, thought through scenarios and responses and backup plans for the backup plans. Because the thing about complex operations is that something always goes wrong. And the question isn't whether things will go wrong. The question is whether you've prepared for things to go wrong and built enough flexibility into your plan that wrong doesn't automatically mean dead. And he built that flexibility, built it into every aspect of his preparation. Because rigidity is fragile, breaks under pressure. But flexibility bends, adapts, survives. And survival was the whole point. Wasn't about glory or revenge or proving anything to anyone, was simply about being alive tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. And each day of aliveness was a victory over the forces that wanted him gone. And so the preparation began in earnest. And the fastest gun in Arizona approached it the way a craftsman approaches a masterwork, with patience that bordered on obsessive and attention to details so small that most men would have dismissed them as irrelevant. But he'd learned through hard experience that battles are lost in the details, are lost in the small oversights that cascade into catastrophic failures. And he was determined not to lose, not through oversight, not through laziness, not through the kind of arrogance that assumes good enough is actually good enough when your life depends on perfect. And so he made perfect his standard, made it his obsession, made it the framework through which he evaluated every aspect of his preparation. And the preparation was comprehensive, was all-encompassing, touched every element of the coming confrontation, because he understood that advantage is cumulative, that small advantages in multiple areas combine into overwhelming superiority. And he was going to need overwhelming superiority because the numbers were against him, would always be against him. And numbers couldn't be changed, but preparation could be changed, could be improved, could be refined until it compensated for numerical disadvantage through positional and psychological and tactical advantages that multiplied his effectiveness. And he started with the most basic element, which was his weapon. And the weapon wasn't just a tool, it was an extension of his will, was the instrument through which intention became reality. And that instrument needed to be perfect, needed to function flawlessly under conditions of extreme stress. And so he disassembled it, completely broke it down to every spring and screw and pin, and cleaned each component individually with an attention to detail that bordered on ritualistic, because ritual creates certainty, and certainty under pressure is the difference between smooth operation and catastrophic malfunction. And he couldn't afford malfunction, couldn't afford the Colt jamming at the wrong moment, or misfiring or failing to extract a spent cartridge, because any of those failures would mean death, would mean all the preparation was wasted, would mean 3 men in a single draw, 7 seconds total, would win through his equipment failure rather than their tactical superiority, and he refused to give them. That victory refused to let mechanical failure accomplish what they couldn't accomplish through skill. And so the weapon was perfect, was cleaned and oiled and tested again until he could operate it in complete darkness, could load and unload and clear malfunctions by touch alone, because vision fails under stress, fails when dust fills the air, or blood runs into your eyes, or the sun is directly in your face. And if you can only operate your weapon by sight, then you can only fight under ideal conditions. And conditions are never ideal, are always compromised by terrain or weather, or the chaos that comes when plans meet reality. And reality always wins that contest, always forces adaptation. And adaptation requires knowing your tools so intimately that thought and action merge into immediate response. And he achieved that merger through repetition, through drawing and dry firing 10,000 times until the motion was unconscious, was programmed into muscle memory so deep that conscious thought couldn't interfere, couldn't slow down the process, couldn't introduce hesitation. And hesitation in a gunfight is death, is the pause that lets your opponent act first, is the delay that turns advantage into defeat. And he eliminated hesitation through preparation, through practice, through the kind of disciplined repetition that athletes and musicians understand, creates performance that transcends conscious effort, and he needed to transcend conscious effort, because conscious effort is slow, is mediated by thought, is vulnerable to fear and doubt, and the paralysis that comes when your brain realizes you're in a situation where mistakes are measured in mortality, and he couldn't afford that. Paralysis couldn't afford to think his way through the crisis, had to feel his way through it, had to trust preparation and training and the patterns he'd burned into his nervous system through endless repetition, and beyond the weapon, he prepared the ground, because terrain is neutral, but understanding of terrain isn't neutral advantages. Whoever studies it better, and he studied it obsessively, walked every foot of the area where he expected contact to occur, mapped distances and angles and lines of sight, and created in his mind a three-dimensional model of the space that he could rotate and examine from every possible perspective. And that mental model became his tactical Bible, became the foundation for every decision about positioning and movement, and when to engage and when to withdraw. Because withdrawal isn't, surrender is tactical. Repositioning is choosing better ground, and better ground wins fights that worse ground loses. And he chose the best ground possible, chose it carefully, chose it with full understanding of how terrain would shape the battle, would funnel movement, would create opportunities and deny them. And opportunity denied to your enemy is opportunity created for yourself. And he created opportunities through positioning, through understanding that the man who controls the high ground or the narrow passage or the corner, with clear sightlines, controls the battle, controls the tempo, controls the psychology. Because men attacking uphill or through narrow passages or into clear fields of fire understand viscerally that they're disadvantaged, and that understanding affects decision-making, affects aggression, affects willingness to close distance and press attacks. And the fastest gun in Arizona needed them, affected, needed them, uncertain, needed them operating from a position of psychological disadvantage that matched their tactical disadvantage. Because psychological and tactical disadvantages compound each other, create a spiral of deteriorating confidence that turns cohesive units into mobs, and mobs into individuals fleeing in different directions. And individuals fleeing can't coordinate, can't support each other, can't maintain the pressure necessary to overwhelm a prepared defender. And he was going to be prepared, was going to be more prepared than any defender in the history of the territory, was going to set a new standard for what preparation meant. And that standard was absolute, was uncompromising, was the kind of thorough planning that professional soldiers would recognize and respect. Because the fastest gun in Arizona, despite never having formal military training, understood warfare at a level that transcended training, understood it the way predators understand hunting, through instinct and observation and the hard lessons that come from survival. And he'd survived long enough to learn those lessons had paid for them in scars and close calls, and nights wondering if the next day would be his last. And those nights, that uncertainty, that intimacy with mortality, had taught him things that couldn't be taught in classrooms or training grounds, had taught him that preparation is the only shield against chaos, is the only way to impose order on the fundamental disorder of combat. And he imposed that order, imposed it through systematic, methodical, comprehensive preparation that left nothing to chance, because chance is chaos's favorite weapon. And he was fighting chaos, fighting randomness, fighting the human tendency to assume that things will work out when things rarely work out unless you make them work out through effort and planning, and the refusal to leave critical outcomes to fortune. And when that moment finally came, when preparation met opportunity and planning transformed into action, the mathematics of the situation became clear in ways that surprised everyone except the fastest gun in Arizona, who had calculated these mathematics weeks earlier, sitting alone in that adobe building, running scenarios in his mind until he could predict outcomes with near certainty. And the certainty he'd achieved through mental rehearsal became physical reality as three men in a single draw, 7 seconds total, moved exactly as he'd predicted, moved with the kind of careless confidence that comes from never having been seriously challenged, never having faced someone who'd done the work, who'd paid the price, who'd transformed himself from ordinary into prepared, and prepared beats unprepared every single time, beats it so consistently that the outcome isn't really in doubt, is just a matter of execution. And he executed flawlessly, executed with the kind of calm that comes from knowing you've done everything possible to ensure success. And that knowledge, that certainty eliminated the doubt that paralyzes lesser men under pressure, and he needed that. Certainty needed that calm because the chaos was coming, was inevitable, was the natural state of combat where plans collide with reality and reality shreds plans, and the survivors are the ones who can adapt, who can think through the chaos, who can maintain mental clarity when everything around them is dissolving into noise and violence and fear. And he maintained that clarity, maintained it through disciplined thinking, through forcing himself to observe rather than react to process information, rather than respond emotionally to make decisions based on tactical reality, rather than the adrenaline dump that was trying to overwhelm his system. And his system wanted to be overwhelmed, wanted to surrender to fight or flight, wanted to stop thinking and start running. But he forced himself to think, forced himself to stay in the moment, to evaluate options, to choose actions based on calculated odds rather than instinct. And instinct in combat is useful, but insufficient, is the baseline that keeps you alive second to second, but doesn't win fights, doesn't create the kind of overwhelming tactical advantage that turns numerical inferiority into functional superiority. And he needed that superiority, needed it desperately, because 3 men in a single draw, 7 seconds total, weren't incompetent, weren't unskilled, weren't the kind of opponents you could beat through simple application of technique. They were dangerous, were experienced, were the kind of men who'd survived dozens of violent encounters. And survival like that doesn't come from luck, comes from capability, from knowing how to fight and win, and they knew how to fight. Could fight effectively when conditions favored them, when they had numbers and initiative and the confidence that comes from having won before. But the fastest gun in Arizona wasn't giving them conditions that favored them, wasn't allowing them initiative, wasn't letting them leverage their numbers into advantage because he'd structured the engagement, he'd chosen the ground. He'd dictated the terms. And dictating terms is everything in combat, is the difference between fighting their fight and making them fight yours. And your fight is always better than their fight when you've prepared for your fight and they've prepared for theirs, and their fight assumed things about terrain and timing and tactical positioning that he wasn't allowing to be true, wasn't permitting to shape the engagement, because permission in combat belongs to whoever seizes it first, and he seized it, completely seized it in ways that left them reacting rather than acting. And reaction is always slower than action, is always disadvantaged, is always playing catch-up, and catch-up in a gunfight means absorbing hits while trying to return fire, means taking casualties while trying to organize, means watching your numerical advantage evaporate under accurate fire delivered from protected positions against exposed targets. And that's what they were now, were exposed. Targets were men caught in the open against a defender who'd prepared the ground, who'd selected firing positions that maximized cover while minimizing exposure, who'd calculated angles and distances with geometric precision and turned the battlefield into a shooting gallery where he was the shooter and they were the targets. And targets don't win gunfights. Targets just die in greater or lesser numbers, depending on how quickly they recognize their targets and break contact. But breaking contact requires leadership, requires coordination, requires someone making the decision that continuing costs more than retreating, and their leadership was disintegrating, was failing under the pressure of casualties and chaos, and the growing realization that nothing was going according to their assumptions about how this would play out. And those shattered assumptions were more dangerous than the bullets, because bullets you can dodge or absorb or return, but shattered assumptions break morale, break cohesion, break the confidence that holds units together under fire. And once that confidence breaks, once the mythology of invincibility reveals itself as mythology, the unit stops being a unit, becomes a collection of individuals focused on personal survival, rather than collective victory. And personal survival in a losing fight means retreat, means abandonment, means every man for himself, and every man for himself is tactical. Dissolution is organizational death, is the transformation from threat to mob, and mobs can't fight coordinated. Defenders can't maintain pressure, can't achieve objectives because they don't have objectives anymore, beyond staying alive long enough to get clear. And getting clear means running, means exposing backs, means giving the fastest gun in Arizona exactly what he needed, which was targets moving away from him, unable to return fire, unable to coordinate, unable to do anything except run and hope against a prepared defender. Is fantasy, is wishful thinking, is the prayer of men who've already lost, but haven't accepted it yet, and the fastest gun in Arizona gave them time to accept it, gave them time to understand that continuing was pointless, was suicidal, was the kind of stubborn commitment to failed plans that gets everyone killed, and they accepted it grudgingly, but definitely accepted that fighting the fastest gun in Arizona cost more than winning could ever be worth, and that calculation, that brutal arithmetic was his real weapon, wasn't the Colt, or the prepared positions, or the superior tactics. It was the cost-benefit analysis. He forced them to make the equation that said attempting this costs X, and succeeding provides Y, and when X exceeds Y, you stop attempting, and they stopped. Not because they couldn't continue, but because continuing was irrational, was the kind of sunk cost fallacy that destroys armies, and they were smart enough or frightened enough or hurt enough to refuse that destruction, to choose tactical retreat over pointless sacrifice. And the retreat was disorderly, was panicked, was the kind of route that professionals spend careers trying to avoid. But they weren't professionals anymore, weren't even a unit anymore, were just individuals running in different directions, and the fastest gun in Arizona let them run, let them go, because pursuit was tactically unnecessary, was strategically counterproductive, was the kind of thing that feels satisfying but accomplishes nothing except exposing yourself to risk when the objective has already been achieved. And the objective had been achieved completely, had been achieved so thoroughly that 3 men in a single draw, 7 seconds total, would never threaten this town again, would never threaten anyone again, because their reputation had been destroyed. Along with their cohesion and reputation in the West everything was the invisible force that made men comply or resist, and without reputation, you're just another group of armed men in a territory full of armed men, and they'd lost their reputation, lost it. Absolutely lost it in 30 seconds of contact against a defender who'd turned their confidence into casualties and their assumptions into ashes. And the sequence that followed has been analyzed by military historians who saw in it principles that would later inform tactical doctrine, because what the fastest gun in Arizona demonstrated was that force multiplication comes from preparation and positioning and psychological advantage, not from numbers. And he had all 3 advantages and used them, systematically working through 3 men in a single draw, 7 seconds total, not with overwhelming violence, but with calculated applications of pressure at exactly the right moments, in exactly the right ways. And each application of pressure created a decision point, and each decision point revealed character, and character under pressure is destiny, and their character under pressure was to panic, to blame each other, to look for escape routes instead of solutions, and each panic, each blame, each escape attempt made them weaker, made them more vulnerable, made them easier to predict, and prediction is everything in combat. Because if you know what your opponent will do, you've already won. You just have to execute, and execution was clean, was professional, was almost mathematical in its precision, because the fastest gun in Arizona had reduced combat to an equation, and was solving that equation one variable at a time, and the variables were falling in exactly the order he'd predicted, which isn't to say it was easy, because nothing about violence is easy, even when you've prepared perfectly, because the stakes are absolute, and absolute stakes create stress that no amount of training fully eliminates. But he'd trained for the stress, had practiced under simulated stress, had learned to function when his heart was trying to beat out of his chest, and his hands were trying to shake, and his brain was screaming at him to run, and functioning under that kind of physiological assault is what separated professionals from amateurs. And he was a professional not by training but by temperament, and by the kind of focused preparation that transforms temperament into capability. And that capability was on full display, and 3 men in a single draw, 7 seconds total, had no answer for it, no counter for it, no response except to absorb the consequences of their own poor planning and worse execution, and those consequences accumulated rapidly in ways that changed the tactical situation from assault to defense, and from defense to retreat, and from retreat to rout. And the rout was complete, was total, was the kind of defeat that breaks organizations, because it breaks the mythology they've built around themselves, the story they tell about their own invincibility. And once that story breaks, once the myth reveals itself to be just a story, the organization has nothing left except individual self-interest, and individual self-interest in a losing fight means abandonment, means every man for himself, means the complete dissolution of whatever unit cohesion might have existed, and the fastest gun in Arizona watched it happen, watched them transform from a threat into a mob, into individuals running in different directions, and he let them run, let them go, not out of mercy but out of calculation, because hunting down scattered survivors would expose him to risk for minimal gain, and his objective had never been to kill everyone. His objective had been to break them, to destroy their will, to make the price of continuing so high that continuing became impossible, and he'd accomplished that objective completely and absolutely. And the aftermath came quickly as word spread, and people who'd been hiding emerged and wanted explanations, wanted to understand how one man had done what entire groups had failed to do, and the fastest gun in Arizona had no good answer for them, because the real answer wasn't something you could teach. It was something you either understood or didn't understand about preparation and will, and refusing to accept the idea that numbers determine outcomes. And most people didn't understand, that wouldn't understand it even after watching it happen, because it contradicted their fundamental assumptions about how conflict works. And changing fundamental assumptions requires either extraordinary evidence or personal experience. And they had the evidence but lacked the experience, and evidence without experience is just a story, and stories can be dismissed as exaggeration or luck or special circumstance. And he let them think whatever they needed to think, because their understanding or lack of understanding didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd survived, had accomplished his objective, had proven to himself that preparation and will were sufficient even against overwhelming numerical odds, and that proof, that validation of his approach, gave him something more valuable than reputation or money or public acknowledgement. It gave him confidence, not the false confidence of arrogance, but the earned confidence of someone who has tested himself at the absolute limit and not been found wanting. And that confidence would carry him through the rest of his life, would inform every decision, every challenge, every moment, when circumstances demanded more than he thought he had to give, because he knew from direct experience that he had reserves he hadn't tapped, that pain is temporary, but quitting is permanent, that the human body and mind are capable of far more than we typically ask of them, and asking more, getting more, pushing past what seemed like limits, and finding that the limits were illusory. That was the real victory, not the tactical outcome, but the personal growth that came from refusing to accept defeat as inevitable. And that growth, that transformation, couldn't be taken away, couldn't be diminished by time or circumstance or the opinions of others, because it was his and his alone, earned through action, not granted through birth or luck or favor. And he carried it quietly without announcement or display, because the people who needed to prove things to others were usually the people who hadn't actually done things, and he'd done things, had proven things to himself, and that was sufficient. And in the final analysis, what the fastest gun in Arizona did mattered less than how he did it, mattered less than the fact that he did it when everyone said it couldn't be done, and that defiance, that rejection of the arithmetic of defeat, became more important than the specific victory, because it established a template, a proof of concept, that impossible is negotiable, that the word can't is usually just shorthand for hasn't yet. And the difference between those two interpretations is everything, is the difference between accepting limitations and testing them, is the difference between living within the boundaries others draw and redrawing the boundaries yourself. And the fastest gun in Arizona redrew boundaries, redrew them with action, not words, with results, not promises, with proof, not theory. And the proof survived him, outlived him, continued to inspire people who never knew his name, but heard the story and understood the underlying principle, which was that human beings are capable of far more than we typically attempt, that our limits are usually self-imposed, are usually accepted without testing, are usually the result of other people's failures being projected onto our potential. And he rejected that projection, rejected those limitations, rejected the idea that his circumstances determined his outcomes, and in rejecting them, demonstrated that rejection was possible, and that demonstration mattered more than any individual achievement, because it showed others what was possible, showed them that the impossible was just the difficult times 10, showed them that 10 times difficult is still achievable if you're willing to pay the price. And he paid that price and proved that paying it was possible, and that proof rippled outward, touched people he never met, influenced decisions he never knew about, contributed to outcomes he never witnessed, because that's how proof works. It doesn't stay contained, doesn't limit itself to the immediate situation. It propagates forward through time and space and minds, until the impossible thing becomes the thing that everyone knows can be done, because someone did it once, and if someone did it once, it can be done again and again and again, until the impossible becomes routine, and routine becomes expectation, and expectation becomes the new baseline for what humans are capable of. And the fastest gun in Arizona moved that baseline, moved it permanently, moved it for everyone who came after. And that movement, that expansion of human potential, was his real legacy. Not the specific tactical victory, but the general principle that victory was possible when preparation met will, and that principle outlived him by generations and will outlive his story by centuries, because principles are immortal in ways that people aren't.